Part 1. Trust Foundation. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here we are. I guess that's how most of these posts start. You think your life is normal, stable, built on something solid, until you realize it wasn't. This all happened in Madison, Wisconsin, and it spans years. Too many years to summarize with a sentence like, "We were together for a while." I met Daniel Harper when I was 23. We worked in the same building, different apartments, crossed paths just enough for small talk to turn into real conversations. Daniel wasn't flashy or charming in an obvious way. He was calm, consistent, the kind of person who shows up when he says he will. That mattered to me more than romance. Trust, for me, was built in repetition, and he repeated all the right things. We started as friends. Long talks after work, shared lunches, complaining about adult life like we were both pretending to understand it. He remembered details about me that felt insignificant at the time, but slowly became important. My anxiety around driving at night. My habit of double-checking locked doors. Stuff no one usually notices. When we eventually started dating, it didn't feel rushed. It felt earned. He talked a lot about honesty, about how lies destroy relationships. Once he said, "If we don't have truth, we have nothing." I remember nodding, feeling lucky. Over the years, trust became automatic. We moved in together, shared finances, made long-term plans. My family trusted him. My friends trusted him. I trusted him enough to stop questioning anything. That's how deep trust works. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels boring, safe, quiet. I thought I knew exactly who he was. I didn't realize that trust isn't just something you build. It's something someone can use. Part 2. False reality. When trust settles in, it quietly starts shaping everything else. I didn't notice it happening at first. I just know that over time, my life slowly rearranged itself around Daniel and the version of reality he presented. I made choices assuming honesty was a given. Career decisions, for example. I turned down a job opportunity in Chicago because Daniel said long distance would change us. I believed him. We talked about a future rooted where we were, so I stayed. At the time, it felt mature, responsible, like a joint decision made by two people on the same page. Our routines became predictable in a comforting way. Same grocery store, same Friday dinners, same shared stories about our days. I never questioned what he told me because there was no reason to. His explanations always made sense. His timelines lined up. His past felt complete. At least the version he shared did. Looking back, the lie wasn't just one thing. It was layered. It lived in omissions, half-truths, and details that conveniently never came up. But at the time, those gaps blended into the background noise of everyday life. Everyone has private corners, right? I adjusted myself without realizing it. I stopped asking certain questions. I stopped pushing when something felt slightly off. Not because he told me to, but because trust trains you to self-edit. You don't want to seem paranoid. You don't want to damage something that feels stable. Friends would joke about how put together our life looked. I agreed. I felt proud of it. I thought consistency meant safety. What I didn't understand was that my reality wasn't just shared with him. It was being quietly directed. The story I was living wasn't false in obvious ways. It was convincing, comfortable, built to last. And that's the most dangerous kind of lie. Because when your life is built on something untrue, you don't feel trapped. You feel at home. Part 3. Truth Moment. The truth didn't come out in a dramatic confession. There was no shouting, no shocking message popping up on his phone while I stood behind him. It arrived quietly, which somehow made it worse. It started with something stupid, a routine paperwork issue. I needed an old document for insurance, something Daniel had always handled because he was better with that stuff. I logged into a shared folder we'd used for years, expecting to find exactly what I was looking for. Instead, I found a name I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was nothing. A former coworker, a client, someone from before we met. But curiosity stuck to me in a way I couldn't shake. I clicked. Then I clicked again. Dates didn't line up. Addresses didn't either. That's when my stomach dropped. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There's always an explanation. I spent hours convincing myself I was misreading things, that context would fix everything once I asked him about it. Still, I kept digging, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because something inside me already knew. What I found wasn't one clear lie. It was a pattern, a second version of his past that didn't match the one I'd lived with for years. Different timelines, different commitments, entire chapters missing from the story I'd been told. I sat there staring at my screen, feeling disconnected from my own body. My hands were shaking, but my thoughts were eerily calm. It felt unreal, like watching someone else's life fall apart. When Daniel came home that night, he smiled like nothing had changed, asked how my day was, kissed my forehead. I almost laughed. That moment, standing in our kitchen, listening to his familiar voice, was when it hit me. The life I trusted wasn't collapsing because of one lie. It was collapsing because I had finally seen the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Part 4. Confrontation. I didn't confront him right away. I needed time to breathe, to convince myself I wasn't overreacting. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times, trying to find a version where this ended calmly. It didn't. That night, I asked him to sit down. My voice sounded too steady for how hard my heart was pounding. I showed him the documents. I asked him to explain the timelines that didn't match, the name I didn't recognize, the years that suddenly had gaps. At first, he looked confused, then defensive, then tired. He said things like, "It's not what it looks like, and you're taking it out of context." I asked him what the context was. He went quiet. That silence felt heavier than any confession. Eventually, pieces started coming out. Slowly, carefully. He admitted he hadn't been honest about parts of his past, about how long certain things lasted, about who knew what and when. Every answer felt incomplete, like he was still managing the truth instead of telling it. I asked him a question that had been burning in my chest for hours. "How long have you been lying to me?" He didn't answer directly. He said he was trying to protect me. He said it didn't matter anymore. That's when something inside me broke. It mattered because my entire life had been built around what he told me. It mattered because trust isn't selective. You don't get to choose which years were real and which were fabricated. I remember telling him, "You don't get credit for the truth after years of lying." He looked genuinely hurt by that, almost offended. That's when I realized he still didn't understand what he'd done. The confrontation didn't give me closure. It gave me clarity. The person sitting across from me wasn't someone who had made a mistake. He was someone who had chosen a lie, every day, for years. Part 5. Psychological impact. I thought once the truth was out, the pain would peak and then slowly fade. That's what people imply when they talk about finding out. Like the worst part is the moment you learn the truth. It's not. The real damage started afterward, when my brain couldn't stop reprocessing my entire life. Memories stopped feeling stable. Moments I used to consider happy now felt contaminated, like they belonged to someone else. I'd replay conversations from years ago and suddenly hear them differently, noticing the pauses, the careful wording, the way he redirected certain topics. I stopped trusting my own judgment. That was the most unsettling part. If I could miss something this big for this long, what else had I misunderstood? I questioned every instinct I'd ever relied on. My confidence eroded quietly, replaced by constant self-doubt. Sleep became unpredictable. Some nights, I was exhausted but wide awake, my mind jumping between anger, grief, and disbelief. Other nights, I slept too much, using unconsciousness as a temporary escape. I became hyper-aware of people's behavior, analyzing tone and body language like it was a survival skill. Emotionally, I felt fragmented. Part of me still cared about him. Another part felt disgusted, and another felt embarrassed, not because I'd done something wrong, but because being deceived for years somehow felt like a personal failure. The lie didn't just change how I saw him. It changed how I saw myself. My past felt unreliable. My present felt unstable. And my future felt terrifyingly open. That's the psychological impact no one warns you about. Deception doesn't just hurt your heart. It rewires your sense of reality. Part 6. Healing. Healing didn't start with forgiveness. It started with distance. I moved out a week after the confrontation. Not dramatically. No slammed doors, no final speeches. Just boxes, silence, and the strange feeling of leaving a place that no longer felt real. I slept on a friend's couch at first, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, trying to convince myself this was actually happening. The first step was accepting that I was hurt in a way I couldn't fix alone. I started therapy, even though part of me hated the idea. Sitting in that room, explaining my story to a stranger, made the lie feel tangible. Real. Something that had actually happened to me, not just something I imagined. I stopped trying to make sense of everything at once. Instead of asking, how could this happen, over and over, I focused on smaller questions. What do I feel right now? What I need today? Sometimes the answer is food. Sometimes sleep. Sometimes nothing but quiet. I learned how to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Some days I felt strong and clear-headed. Other days I felt raw and angry all over again. Healing wasn't linear. It looped, stalled, and doubled back on itself. I also learned to be kinder to myself. I stopped blaming myself for trusting someone who had proven himself trustworthy for years. Trust wasn't my weakness, it was my intention. The lie wasn't a reflection of my intelligence or worth. Slowly, my nervous system began to calm. I slept better. My thoughts stopped racing quite so fast. I started reconnecting with parts of myself I neglected, old hobbies, old friendships, quiet routines that belonged only to me. Healing didn't mean the damage disappeared. It meant I learned how to live with the truth without letting it destroy me. Part 7. Learning to rebuild trust. One of the hardest things to accept was that healing wasn't just about getting over Daniel. It was about learning how to exist in a world where trust no longer felt automatic. I didn't suddenly become cynical, but I did become cautious in a way I never had been before. I noticed it in small interactions. When friends made promises, I mentally prepared for them not to follow through. When someone told me something personal, a quiet voice in my head wondered what they were leaving out. I hated that part of myself, but I also understood where it came from. Trust used to feel like muscle memory. Now it required conscious effort. My therapist once asked me what trust meant to me now. I didn't know how to answer. For years, it had meant consistency, shared routines, familiarity. Now those things felt neutral at best, or dangerous at worst. I had to redefine trust from the ground up. I started with boundaries, saying no when something didn't feel right, not oversharing just to create closeness, letting relationships develop slowly instead of rushing toward emotional certainty. At first, it felt lonely. Distance can feel a lot like isolation when you're not used to it. But over time, something shifted. I began noticing who respected my boundaries without questioning them, who showed up without needing reassurance, who didn't push for access to parts of me I wasn't ready to share. Those people became my new reference point. Rebuilding trust wasn't about finding someone better. It was about trusting myself again, my instincts, my discomfort, my need for clarity. I learned that trust doesn't mean assuming the best blindly. It means staying present enough to notice when something feels off and strong enough to listen when it does. Part 8. Anger I was afraid to feel. For a long time, I avoided anger. It felt ugly, dangerous. I told myself I was being mature by staying calm, by understanding his perspective, by focusing on healing instead of blame. In reality, I was just scared of what would happen if I let myself feel it. Anger changes things. It demands acknowledgement. It crept up on me in unexpected moments. While washing dishes, while driving past familiar places, while listening to someone casually talk about honesty like it was a given. Suddenly my chest would tighten, and I'd feel this sharp, burning resentment that had nowhere to go. I was angry that he took years from me. Angry that he made decisions for my life without my consent. Angry that he got to control the narrative for so long while I trusted it blindly. But beneath all of that was another layer, anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. Therapy helped me understand that anger wasn't the enemy. It was information. It was my mind finally catching up to what my boundaries should have been all along. Suppressing it hadn't made me stronger. It had just delayed the reckoning. I started letting myself feel it without acting on it. I wrote things down I never planned to send. I spoke out loud in empty rooms. I let myself say, "This was wrong," without immediately softening it. And something surprising happened. The anger didn't consume me. It passed through me. Once I stopped resisting it, it lost its power. It no longer needed to shout to be heard. It became a signal, not to destroy, but to protect. Feeling anger didn't mean I was stuck in the past. It meant I was finally standing on my side. Part 9. Grieving a life that wasn't real. I expected to grieve the relationship. What I didn't expect was to grieve an entire version of my life, one that never actually existed the way I thought it did. It felt strange mourning something intangible. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is what I lost." Instead, it was a collection of assumptions, memories, and future plans that quietly dissolved once the truth was out. The trips we talked about taking, the milestones we assumed we'd reach together, the sense of stability I'd built my identity around. I found myself grieving in waves. Some days I missed him. Other days, I missed the person I was before everything unraveled. The version of me that trusted easily, that didn't overanalyze tone or timing, that believed consistency meant honesty. Photos were the hardest. Not because I wanted them back, but because I didn't know how to categorize them anymore. Were those moments real if the foundation behind them wasn't? I stared at smiling images and felt disconnected, like I was looking at someone else's life. Friends told me, at least some of it was real. I know they meant well, but that sentence didn't bring comfort. It just made things blurrier. When deception lasts long enough, it stains even the truth around it. Grief, I learned, isn't logical. It doesn't wait for permission. It shows up in grocery stores, in quiet mornings, in the sudden realization that you don't know who you would have become if the lie hadn't shaped your choices. Letting go of a false reality hurts in a unique way. Because you're not just saying goodbye to a person. You're saying goodbye to the life you thought you were living. Part 10. Reclaiming my narrative. For a long time, it felt like Daniel owned my story. Not because he was still in my life, but because his lie had shaped so much of it. Every major decision I'd made during those years felt contaminated, like it all needed an asterisk next to it. At some point, I realized that if I kept viewing my past only through the lens of deception, I'd never move forward. The lie would stay in control. So I started doing something uncomfortable. I reframed my memories. Not to excuse him, not to rewrite history, but to take ownership back. Those years weren't meaningless just because they were built on false information. The emotions I felt were real. The growth I experienced was real. Even the love I gave was real, and that mattered. I stopped saying he wasted my time and started saying I lived those years with integrity. That shift didn't absolve him, but it released me. His choices didn't get to define my character. I wrote my story down, not like this, not for strangers, but for myself. Page after page of what I remembered, how I felt, what I learned. Seeing it laid out in my own words helped me understand that my life wasn't a lie. Someone else's deception doesn't erase your truth. Taking my narrative back didn't happen all at once. It happened every time I chose not to minimize what I went through. Every time I corrected someone who tried to oversimplify it. Every time I reminded myself that surviving this didn't make me weak, it made me aware. The lie shaped part of my life, but it doesn't get to write the ending. Part 11. Learning to live with uncertainty. One unexpected consequence of everything was how uncomfortable uncertainty became. Before, I believed that if you planned carefully and trusted the right person, life would make sense. There would be a clear direction, a share map. After the lie, that belief was gone. I struggled with not knowing what people really meant, not knowing how long things would last, not knowing whether stability was real or just temporary. At first, that uncertainty terrified me. I tried to control it by overplanning, by analyzing every decision, by searching for guarantees that didn't exist. Eventually, I burned out. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. Certainty had always been an illusion. I just hadn't seen it before. The lie didn't create uncertainty, it exposed it. And fighting that reality was only exhausting me. I started practicing sitting with unanswered questions, letting conversations end without full clarity, letting relationships evolve without demanding immediate definitions. It felt reckless at first, like stepping onto unstable ground on purpose. But slowly it became freeing. I learned that uncertainty doesn't mean danger. It means possibility. It means you're not trapped in a script someone else wrote for you. I didn't need absolute guarantees to feel safe. I needed self-trust. Living with uncertainty taught me flexibility. It taught me resilience. It taught me that my worth doesn't depend on predictability or permanence. For the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't trying to recreate the past or protect myself from every possible outcome. I was just living, and that felt like progress. Part 12. The moment I forgave but didn't forget. I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone off the hook. I thought it meant saying, "It's okay, I'm over it," and then moving on like nothing happened. But what I learned is that forgiveness isn't for them. Forgiveness is for you. It's the moment you stop letting someone else's actions control your emotions. I didn't forgive Daniel right away. Not even close. There were months when I wanted nothing more than to scream, to ruin him the way he'd ruined my sense of reality. But revenge didn't feel satisfying. It felt like feeding the anger. One day, I realized something. Holding on to hatred was keeping me tied to him. It kept me looking backward. It made the lie feel alive. It gave it power. So I did the hardest thing. I let go of the need for him to feel sorry. I forgave him in my own quiet way. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to stop letting him live rent-free in my head. I forgave him for the deception, the manipulation, the years of falsehood. I forgave him for the way he made me question my own mind. But I didn't forget. Forgiveness didn't mean I trusted him again. It didn't mean I wanted him back. It didn't mean I believed his version of the truth. It just meant I stopped letting the lie dictate my emotions. And that was huge. It felt like I've been holding a heavy object for years, and finally, I put it down. I still feel the weight sometimes, a memory, a trigger, a moment of doubt. But the difference now is that I don't carry it everywhere. I don't let it define me. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain. It just made space for something else. Something that wasn't him. Something that was mine. Part 13. A new kind of trust. After all of this, I realized I had to build trust again. Not with someone else, but with myself. That was the part one didn't expect. I used to think trust was something you gave away. Like a gift. You gave it to someone and hoped they didn't drop it. But after being lied to for years, I learned that trust is also something you earn from yourself. I started paying attention to my instincts again. Not the panic ones, but the quiet ones. The ones that whisper when something feels off. I learned to listen without immediately judging myself for feeling that way. I started setting boundaries and keeping them. When something didn't feel right, I said so. When someone crossed the line, I spoke up. I stopped shrinking myself to avoid conflict. I stopped assuming people would leave if I asked for honesty. I also started trusting my own timeline. I stopped comparing my healing to anyone else's. Some people moved on quickly. Others took years. Neither version made me weak or strong. It just made us human. I rebuilt my life with small, deliberate choices. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from. I took up hobbies I'd abandoned. I traveled alone for the first time in years, and it was terrifying and amazing. In those moments, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Not the kind of control that comes from manipulating a situation. The kind that comes from knowing you can handle the truth, no matter what it is. I still carry scars. I probably always will. But the scars remind me that I survived something that could have broken me completely. And that, I think, is the real lesson. Trust is fragile, but you can rebuild it. even when the foundation crumbles. Part 14, Moral. If you're reading this and you've ever been lied to for years, I want you to know something first. You didn't deserve it. That's the moral I kept trying to ignore because it felt too simple. But the truth is, it's the most important part. Deception doesn't happen because you're weak or naive. It happens because someone else chose to use your trust as a tool. And that choice says more about them than it ever will about you. The biggest lesson I learned is that truth isn't just about facts. It's about consistency. It's about being the same person in private as you are in public. It's about not building your life on stories that only you believe. I also learned that trust isn't something you should give away blindly, but it also shouldn't be something you stop giving entirely because someone broke it. The world is full of people who deserve honesty. The problem is, after being lied to, you don't know who they are anymore. That's why rebuilding trust is a process. It takes time. It takes boundaries. It takes learning to listen to yourself again. It takes accepting that some people are going to disappoint you, and that doesn't mean you're wrong for trusting in the first place. Most importantly, I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means living with the truth without letting it ruin you. And if there's one thing I want anyone to take from my story, it's this. Your life is not invalid just because someone else lied about it. You can rebuild. You can move forward. You can still trust. You just have to do it on your terms. Because the truth, even when it hurts, is the only thing that can set you free.